Good afternoon, everybody. I found the questions that we already heard very, very ambitious and very interesting. Probably I'll be not able to answer them all, but maybe I'll manage at least to give some hints with regard to some of the questions. I was asked I was told that this conference is on the question what science can do for acceptable general living conditions in the future. And the speakers are asked to tell something about that with regard to the work they are doing. As regards me, this means that I have to tell you something about sustainability, but to tell you something about sustainability from the perspective of a social scientist, not of a natural scientist. By training, I'm a lawyer, a sociologist, and philosopher. To tell you something about sustainability from the perspective of a social scientist would probably take much more than, 40 minutes. So I'll just choose maybe the biggest sustainability issue that we face at the moment. This might be climate change, but please take all I say just as an example for many other questions that could be discussed here. And nevertheless, I believe that talking about climate change is something that is very crucial for the future of the world society. And once again, keep in mind, I will not talk about it from the perspective of a natural scientist. I know pretty well that the Max Planck Gesellschaft mainly focuses on questions of natural science. I know it quite well because my father was a director in the Max Planck Institute in Berlin many years ago. But we'll just change the perspective a little bit for today. My general thesis would be that in terms of, or with regard to climate change, natural and social science provide a lot of analysis, a lot of explanations, a lot of technical options, policy options, also some normative criteria. Many people believe that it is not possible to come to normative criteria from a scientific point of view. I cannot really talk about this problem today. I can just tell you that, unfortunately, in opposite to what most natural scientists and economists believe, most lawyers and philosophers are convinced that there are objective answers also to normative questions. Maybe there's some leeway, but you also have this problem with regard to questions of facts. Anyway, science can offer a lot of answers with regard to the questions I mentioned, but maybe science can also foresee or kind of foresee that we may fail in solving the problem of climate change. I cannot say that definitely. I'm no visionary in the negative meaning of visionary. A visionary, when you translate it to German, cannot only be someone who has good ideas, but can also be someone who pretends to know exactly what happens in the future. And of course, I don't know that. How could I? But I just try to show you that there are some tendencies that are very dangerous, and there are also some scientific insights that show that it might be very difficult to put the answers that exist in theory into practice. As I mentioned earlier, the energy and climate problem might be one of the biggest, or maybe just the biggest societal challenge that we face in the 21st century. And just as it is typical for sustainability problems, it's a combination of two aspects. It's an aspect of scarcity, and it's a problem of damages that arise from an overuse of a resource that is scarce. Regarding energy and climate problem, the scarce resource is fossil fuels. Modern human life, especially Western life, is highly based on fossil fuels, such as oil, gas, or coal. not only for electricity, also for heating, for mobility, for fertilizers, etc. Fossil fuels are crucial, but they are, of course, limited. The question is only how long will we still have fossil fuels? The probably more dangerous thing is that the overuse of fossil fuels leads to climate change. I will not talk about the natural science details of climate change here. And I just want to stress the probable social or societal consequences that global climate change might have. There's nothing funny in it at all. It's probably very dangerous in terms of economy, and also in terms of peace, because when the world is getting warmer, this is relevant for the global food supply and water supply, and this might cause civil wars and also wars between states. And this is also something, I mean, it sounds cynical, but just to mention it, that is very, very expensive, of course. And keeping that in mind, it is very strange that with regard to the German elections at the moment, all people talk about how expensive electricity is. Is it some sense more or less? And compared to the economic, just to mention the economic consequences of climate change, it is very, very strange to have such a narrow perspective on that. In theory, the solution to the energy and climate topic sounds pretty easy. We have to overcome fossil fuels. I mean, it's too simple to put it like that, but just for the sake of this presentation, please let me put it like that. We have to overcome fossil fuels sooner or later. It's not the only relevant area of action. Climate change is also strongly related to land use, but a lot of the land use problems about climate change are also connected to fossil fuels. It's the fertilizers, the mineral fertilizers once again. From the perspective of natural scientists, this sounds like a perfect research area. Okay, we have a problem, we have to get rid of fossil fuels, we need to replace them by, I don't know, renewable energies, for instance. We need to be more energy efficient, and we just need new technical solutions. In theory, this is a good perspective, but you have to keep in mind that it's not just about using a bit less oil, gas, or coal. The climate problem is about overcoming fossil fuels in the end. At least this is what natural science on a worldwide scale tells us. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the committee of the natural science climate researchers worldwide, tells us that if we want to avoid consequences like lack of food, water, etc., we have to cut down global greenhouse gas emissions by around about 80% on a global scale by 2050 compared to 1990. And this is quite a lot when you want to do it just by technical options, and at the same time want to go on with the path of economic growth, not only in countries where you have hunger like Tanzania or Bangladesh, but also in Western countries, because it's pretty obvious when people are getting richer, this usually implies that also the overuse of resources and the greenhouse gas emissions may increase. This leads to the question, what can technical options do with regard to climate change? Can they solve the problem at all? Can they solve it alone? Technical options are something very interesting, not only for natural scientists that do research on technical options, also for societies in general, because technical options are compatible with economic growth. You can sell technical options. You can sell solar energy or wind energy or energy efficiency tools. And therefore, they are easily compatible with the modern Western economy that we know. And what is also so nice about technical options is that they are highly compatible with our, let's call it, human convenience. We can just go on living the way we do, at least it sounds like, and we just change the technological basis of our life. And this is why it is also on a political level so highly attractive only to talk about technical solutions for climate change. Talk about renewable energies, energy efficiency, maybe also nuclear power or carbon capture and storage, which means running coal plants and then storaging the CO2 under the soil. I cannot really talk about these technical options in detail. I just want to formulate a thesis, and this is that of course technical options are highly relevant for tackling the climate problem, but it might occur that technical options cannot take us all the way. Maybe they can take us big part of the way, but maybe not all the way. And there's some reasons which I will try to explain shortly for saying that technical options alone cannot do it. We also need a change of behavior, which is something that can be more dangerous for economic growth, for instance, and can be more dangerous for our convenience. In theory, it's very simple. I can tell you, I don't know, stop going by car, stop going by plane, stop eating meat, etc. It sounds very easy, but it sounds not nice for most people, especially in Western countries and for the rich people in the newly industrializing countries. This would be behavioral change. So let's check out what technical options can do. The one argument to believe the technical options alone are not enough is the problem is maybe just too big. To cut down emissions by around about 80%, or in the high emission countries such as Germany by, I don't know, maybe up to 95%. This is what the EU Commission says. And at the same time, go on with economic growth implies such an extreme rate of such an extreme speed of technical innovation that we never had in human history, not at all. And this at least raises some doubts whether we can do it only by technique. The second argument that technique alone might be not enough is that it is rather questionable if there is a technical answer for some areas of greenhouse gas emissions at all. The example is meat consumption, or just consumption of food by animals such as milk, cheese, etc. As you probably all know, 1 calorie from meat, for instance, implies that the animal is eaten around about 7, or let's say 4 to 14 calories by, I don't know, wheat or corn in advance. And therefore, you need much more fertilizer, much more transport, etc., to have meat in the end. Of course, you can solve this problem. I mean, the problem of the fossil fuel and the fertilizers easily, in theory. You could say we just switch completely to organic farming, but what would happen then? If we would switch to organic farming on a worldwide scale, I mean, I love organic farming. I buy all my food in an organic food shop, but what would happen when we would do it on a worldwide scale? We would have less to eat. Yeah? And people would, I don't know, would die from hunger. This is one option. This is not a good option, obviously. Or we would have to eat less meat. Then we could maybe get rid of the mineral fertilizers. And this is what I want to tell you here, this is obviously not a technological option. This is a behavioral option, and one that is obviously not very popular. I mean, I'm a vegetarian since, I don't know, 1993. That's no problem at all, but many people don't like that. Especially men. Especially men usually don't like it. When you look at young Germans, there's a big difference. Young German women are, I don't know, when you go to universities, you have sometimes 20% of vegetarians among women. But with men, it's very often completely different. There are some more aspects that raise doubts about the power of technical options. One, for instance, is that energy alone takes us nowhere. We need energy for doing things, for running a car, for running a plane, etc. And at least the materials for building these things are definitely scarce sooner or later. So even if we would find a very visionary solution for the energy thing, the other scarcities in life would remain. And this leads to the thesis, or maybe hypothesis, that sooner or later technical options will find their limits. And this would be something very trivial, maybe because the world is limited. Human beings are limited. I know that for natural scientists it sounds sometimes not as trivial as it sounds for social scientists, but anyway. I mean, of course, I'm not a visionary in the bad meaning of visionary. I don't know exactly what will happen in the future, but I just try to give you some hints that there are some problems about the only technical solutions path. So what can we do, given this as a fact, what I mentioned so far? We need policy options to get a better framework and to cut down our greenhouse gas emissions. But what happens in reality is exactly the opposite. The greenhouse gas emissions on a worldwide scale have increased by around about 30% since 1990. Many people believe this was just a problem of, I don't know, China or USA, and the EU is great. It's the climate role model, especially Germany. If you believe that too, I have to disappoint you. Germany and also the EU in general is not as successful as especially politicians keep saying and media keep saying. At the end of the day, it's the numbers that count, and if you just watch the per capita emissions of the average German or the average EU citizen, it's still 4 or 5 times higher than the emission rate that would be sustainable when every man and woman on a worldwide scale would have the same emission rate. For instance, when you just mentioned CO2, maybe 1 or 1.5 or 2 tons CO2 per capita on a worldwide scale would be sustainable. In Germany, you have around about 8 to 10 tons, and it depends on how you count. The government says 8 tons, but this is maybe not just correct. So in absolute numbers, you cannot say that Germany is a role model so far. Of course, we are a kind of role model in terms of discussions, in terms of technical options, in terms of conferences. You have conferences like that, and you have a lot more. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of NGOs, and a lot of companies that do interesting and ambitious things. But in the end, it's the numbers that count. And numbers are not good yet. Also, the how you call it, relative direction of our development in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is not really good so far in Germany. I mean, just take Germany as an example now. German government keeps saying that We reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 25% since 1990. Unfortunately, this is not correct because there's a lot of fake about the way they count. One problem is the relocation effects are always forgotten. A lot of greenhouse gas emissions just moved to other countries because we buy more and more products that stem from other countries, such as cars, mobile phones, etc. And this, alone this, when you just take this effect, this causes a relocating effect of around about 15%. There are some more problematic effects on the way how emissions are counted. I just don't want to mention them here. Just want to stress that we talk a lot in Europe and in Germany, but what we do in reality is sometimes slightly different. Of course, this leads to the question: what's wrong about our climate policy? Because when you're interested in climate policy, or when you just read the newspapers or read all the stuff on the internet, you get the impression that we have so much EU and German climate legislation, energy legislation. So how come that we're not more successful? We have to answer these questions in two parts. The first part is, and this is the one you have in the second big bullet point here on this slide, we have to accept that governance is a difficult thing. Choosing policy instruments is a difficult thing. It's not just enough to do anything. You have to choose the right instruments, and this is what very often doesn't work. And this is true no matter whether you believe in the only technical options way or if you believe in behavioral change or in both, just like me. You need some framework that leads to societies using new technologies, changing behavior. This probably will not happen just by coincidence. Why it will probably not happen by coincidence, I'll try to tell you on the next slide, but the first part of my answer, why we aren't more successful, is the governance aspect. This is my thesis at this point, very often choose the wrong instruments. We tend to forget that the climate problem and also many other sustainability problems are problems of quantities. It's not just about making one car better or one industrial plant better. It is about an absolute reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And we need instruments who manage that. And it's about absolute reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in a world where you usually have economic growth. And this is the first small bullet point. Very often climate policy focuses on single cars, single flats, single technical tools, tries to optimize them by some obligations on cars, limit values, whatever. But what is forgotten is the rebound effect. When you make a car, for instance, more energy efficient, it might happen that you make it more energy efficient, but at the same time you have bigger cars and more cars, and this kills the effect that you could have had in terms of greenhouse gas emissions if you just watch this a single car, focus on the single car. This is also true for flats, for instance. You have obligations in Europe to optimize the heating insulations, etc. But this tends to oversee that people have bigger and bigger flats, and this shows that it's not enough just to have more efficient buildings. You need laws or policy instruments that lead in the end to less greenhouse gas emissions. This is also true with regard to the second problem, which I call relocating effects. Climate is a global thing, so it's not enough to cut down greenhouse gas emissions just in one country and relocate them to another country. When you do something just in one country or on one continent, let's say in the EU. You need some mechanism that makes sure that the emissions not just relocate. There are instruments for that, but they are not used yet. I'll mention them at the end of my presentation. There are some more problems. I cannot mention them all. I just want to mention the last small bullet point: poor enforcement. Very often we have climate legislation or climate policy instruments that exist in theory but don't exist properly in reality. This is not only true for countries in, I don't know, maybe Africa or Asia. This is also true for European countries. We sometimes are a bit too self-confident with regard to that. But I think the more interesting part of my answer on the question why we aren't more successful is the second part, which I want to talk about now, and this is the part that deals with the problem how societal change works. When you want to have a framework for technological development or for behavioral change, you need to know first what kind of instruments work. This is what we talked about during the last minutes. But you also, secondly, need to know, to put it simple, how human beings behave. What triggers human beings? I mean, citizens, politicians, managers, and enterprises. If you don't put that correctly, you'll probably choose the wrong instruments. Many people in politics and also sometimes in science believe that sustainability is just something about knowledge. You just have to tell people buy more efficient cars, or just omit buying cars, or omit going by plane, or I'll tell you something about, I don't know, greenhouse gas emission effects of going by plane, and then people change their behavior. This is what many politicians and also many human beings believe. This is why the climate discussion is very often a discussion about knowledge, about how to transport knowledge. But when it comes to reality, you will see, at least in a country like Germany or France or Great Britain, there are a lot of people that know quite a lot about climate change. And especially these people, very often it's young people, go a lot by plane and buy a lot of things, a lot of electronic stuff, etc. And this is not as strange as it looks at first glance. We know from science, we know from sociology, biology, psychology, economics, etc., that knowledge is just one aspect that motivates people. No matter whether you talk about politicians, managers, or citizens, knowledge is a relevant thing, of course, but it's not the only thing that motivates us to make our daily decisions. And you also cannot just say, like you find it, I don't know, in the newspapers, that climate change is just something about economic power or political power. Of course, this is relevant for explaining whether certain policy options occur or not. But I think you have to put it more precise. You have to put more precise what motivates people. And it's not only knowledge. The first important thing is to admit that human beings interact. What politicians do highly depends on what voters want. And what voters, or let's say citizens, do is highly dependent on the legislation, for instance, that politicians pass. The same is true with regard to companies on the one hand and consumers on the other hand. They are also interdependent. Or to put it more negative, it might happen that you have just vicious circles between politicians and citizens and between companies and consumers. And this is what happens so far in terms of sustainability in general, very often, but also in terms of energy and climate, the energy and climate topic, that nobody really moves because everybody's stuck in a way and feels that he or she cannot move alone. No matter whether you talk to a politician, a manager, or just a normal person on the street. But why is everybody stuck? I think there's some slightly obvious aspects that may be able to explain that. The first thing is human beings are not just motivated by knowledge. Human beings are very often motivated by conceptions of normality. Human beings live in a real world. They can discuss a lot. Also scientists. This is not only true for so-called stupid people. Yeah, this is also true for scientists. We can discuss a lot, yeah, for the rest of the week or month or whatever. But we live in a real world. And in this real world, you have a lot of filling stations, a lot of airports, a lot of buffets, and a lot of friends on Facebook that have nice pictures from their holiday in Malaysia and can tell you how nice it is to go there. And this is the real world you live in. And when you watch yourself, or me, correctly, you find out easily that very often what we talk is the one thing, what we say is the one thing, but what we do in reality is something completely different. And one major explanation for that is conceptions of normality. Of course, it is possible to change conceptions of normality, but you cannot just do it by a master plan. Social or societal change occurs, but it usually occurs slowly, and it's not very easy to formulate an instrument for changing it. It's quite difficult. The second small bullet point, and it's a bit similar, of course, is emotions. Human beings are usually highly motivated by emotions, and one typically important emotion is things that are far away and are very complex, usually for most human beings don't look really important. Climate change is so complex, it's so far away, and I just cannot feel the connection between me entering my car or going to work or university or whatever and the dead Bangladeshi in 50 years. I can, on a scientific basis, I can discuss this connection, but on a daily behavioral basis, it doesn't feel relevant at all for most people, at least for most people, maybe even for all people. There are some more aspects such as convenience, the tendency of forgetting about things, etc., that might be named emotions, and that are also probably not very productive in terms of fighting climate change. There are other aspects, just to mention them shortly. Of course, human egoism is a relevant thing, no matter whether you talk about politicians or managers or normal citizens. It's also traditional values, it's past dependencies, and of course it's also the problem of collective goods. Every politician, every citizen, every manager knows he or she cannot solve the global climate problem alone. This can be more or less demotivating in many situations. So this was my thesis at the begining, right? I told you that there is a danger when you talk about climate change from a scientific point of view, that you might come to the result that in theory it's quite obvious what we have to do, but there is a danger that we just will not do what we could do. But just to give a more optimistic perspective at the end of my presentation, what could we do? I mean, I don't mean in terms of technical options or whatever. I told you already that I like technical options, but I don't believe technical options alone can do it. And I strongly don't believe that technical options just occur in daily life. You need a framework that puts technical options to practice, that puts technical options to daily life. Renewable energies are not something that are interesting in the laboratory. They are interesting when you have them on the fields, when you just have them in daily life, and you need instruments to bring them there. The overall answer, how we could get to better technological options and also to some behavioral change, is this is the positive version of the vicious circle, we need a kind of better ping pong between mental change in society and better policy options. Because you cannot have mental change alone, at least with regard to the problem of collective goods. It's just too unlikely that only by societal change, which tends to be very slowly, we solve such a big and urgent problem such as climate change. We also need some political pressure. We need some instruments that force people to change their life in a way. But of course, by the same token, policy options alone cannot do it, because a politician or a parliamentarian majority that chooses a completely different climate policy just today would probably be voted out of office. And this is why you need a ping pong between societal or mental change on the one hand and better policy options on the other hand. And there's no easy way of saying how to get there. You can just, I can describe, this is what I'll do at the end of my presentation now, you can describe the policy options that would work better than the ones we use so far. But how to come to societal change is something really difficult. Of course, you can say we need more role models. Role models are something that work very well. You have people that really show you, I don't go by car, I don't go by plane, I don't eat meat, and I'm so happy. Yeah, and I'm telling everyone on Facebook, on reality, etc. This is attractive in a way, and this is how societal change happens very often. And you can also, I don't know, join NGOs, you can join demonstrations, you can do things on the internet, you can join political parties, etc. Of course, we can do all these things, but you cannot reduce all these things just to one golden path or one central idea, one easy thing. In theory, as I mentioned earlier, global change is a global thing. Climate change is a global thing. This is a major reason why the political instruments answer in terms of climate change. In theory, it has to be global. But when it comes to reality, of course, we all know the global climate policy failed so far. We cannot discuss that in detail, but just to put it simple, it doesn't look much like we'll have a strong global climate legislation during the next years. But are there other options that are more realistic? And I think there is one. The EU could try to become a real role model. I mean, not just a role model by talking, like this so far, and a role model by conferences and by discussing technological options, etc. We could do another EU climate policy. How could it work? I told you climate or greenhouse gas emissions are something that has to be discussed in terms of quantities. How can we put quantity reduction instruments into practice? And I have to put it very simple. Sorry for that, but just to put it very simple, the major instrument has to be pricing fossil fuels. We have to take fossil fuels out of the markets step by step. And you can do it by quantity reduction goals for greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, by absolute quantity reduction goals for the whole world, or at least for the whole EU. Or you could do it just by pricing fossil fuels by means of charges. Just on the EU level for the first step. I mean, to be more precise, it's not just enough to price only fossil fuels. It would be necessary also to price land use higher than we do it before, because some emission-relevant aspect of land use, such as fertilizers, of course, can be triggered by pricing fossil fuels, but there are some more aspects of land use that are relevant, are not connected to fossil fuels. Or just to put it simple, let's talk about fossil fuels. When you're interested more detailed in climate policy, the idea would be to strongly optimize the EU emissions trading that we have so far. We already have a system of quantity reduction goals in the EU, which is called EU emissions trading scheme. This is this works with absolute quantity reductions for certain industries. But the system we have so far has a lot of mistakes. One is the quantity reduction goals are just not strict enough, or they're not ambitious enough. Another problem is that it's just some industries that are covered by this system. We need overall reduction goals that also cover heating and mobility and fertilizers. To put it shortly, we need a system that covers primary energy use. And this, from a legal or political point of view, could be done easily in theory by changing the basis of emissions trading from certain industries to primary energy. The primary energy companies in the EU would be obliged to sell primary fossil energy only when they auctioned a certificate for the greenhouse gas emissions first. The greenhouse gas emissions that are usually caused by this amount of fossil fuels. And the amount of certificates that are auctioned every year would just decrease step by step. The result would be the primary energy companies would pay more and more for auctioning the certificates. They would pass the costs to the consumers and to other companies. And the result would be a big incentive for the single citizen or single company to switch to renewable energies, to switch to more energy efficiency, and sometimes also to sufficiency, to behavioral change, to omit certain things, for instance, going by cars sometimes or going by plane. The nice thing about such a system is that you don't have to know as a politician in advance how much technical options can do, because you just give a framework and then reality will show, can technical options alone manage to match these greenhouse gas emission reductions or not. Technical options, as I mentioned earlier, are highly attractive, so probably most people, most companies will firstly try to choose the technical options. But when the result is that technical options is not enough, then people will change their behavior. Of course, such a governance approach will not occur in reality if you don't have societal change at the same time. This is what I mentioned earlier. There is no wonder instrument for solving the problem of climate change. You can propose an instrument like that, but if you want to have it in reality, you need societal change at the same time. Otherwise, we will not have something like that. Of course, formulating an instrument like that is much more difficult in reality. The idea is just very interesting. If you had absolute reduction goals, this would, for instance, completely avoid rebound effects and relocating effects. But be careful, relocating effects can also occur not only within the EU, but also between, for instance, EU and China. And of course, it would take the global climate nowhere when such a system would lead to the result that all the, steel companies would just leave Europe, go to China, and have their emissions there. So what we would have to add to such a system is a tool called border adjustments. Border adjustments are compatible with WTO law, with world trade law, and make sure that you have no eco-dumping on a global scale. When one country prices fossil fuels with such a system, it is entitled at the border to have a border adjustment, a border tax adjustment that leads to the result that, for instance, products from China, let's say cars, pay a kind of tax, a kind of charge that makes sure that there is a level playing field between, let's say, German steel production and Chinese steel production. I just have to mention one more aspect. What I told you now is that an overall climate policy approach that might be quite ambitious is compatible with economic development. Maybe it is not compatible with economic growth one day, when it shows that technical options alone are not enough. But is it compatible with social distributive justice? Because many people might say now, pricing fossil fuels is very bad for, I don't know, my grandma, or just pensioners or poor people in Western countries. And what about the rest of the world, by the way? What is the idea for the rest of the world? The overall idea for the rest of the world is that more and more countries should participate in such a system. This is also a question that is highly relevant in terms of social distributive justice, because in my opinion, I mean, I don't give a normative talk today, but I could also discuss that in terms of law and philosophy. In my opinion, from a normative point of view, it is strongly important to solve the climate problem or sustainability problems on the one hand, but also solve the problem of poverty and hunger on the other hand. And how can we do that? We could offer countries, for instance, from Africa and South America to become part of such a system. They would, by means of the system, have a kind of cap for their greenhouse gas emissions, which is a lot higher than the real greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. So it wouldn't force the countries at all at the moment to do whatever, but it would give them a long time framework where to go, and not to repeat just the German or European mistakes of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, because the cap moves like that, right? It decreases step by step. And when you're a country like, I don't know, Tanzania, your actual emission rate would be, I don't know, here, cap is here, and cap moves in this direction. And this shows you where you have to go in, I don't know, in 10, 20, or 30 years. And what you need now is the money to go there. And you could get this money by the system if you would distribute the certificates in a way that makes sure that the revenues from the system is earned by the southern countries. I cannot really go into detail here, but from the administrative point of view, this would be pretty easy. The overall idea, in my opinion, must be to have global caps, and at the same time, make sure that the revenues are used for the countries that still need economic and social development. But just as the last idea of my presentation, when we discuss questions of social distributive justice, we should never forget social distributive justice is not just a thing that is about energy prices. Climate change itself might be a catastrophe for social distributive justice if we just do nothing. And this is, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, something that is very often forgotten in the European and especially in the German debate. We talk about the grandma that maybe gets problems paying for her electricity when we price fossil fuels, but we forget the consequences of climate change in terms of food supply, water supply, that are much more catastrophic than just electricity prices. Okay, thanks a lot.